During a storm that engulfs a coastal city in chaos, an eccentric billionaire makes an unexpected gesture. He pays for the groceries of a homeless mother, desperate to feed her children. What seems like an act of pure generosity soon reveals a thread of hidden intentions and imminent betrayals. With the evacuation announcement echoing through the city, the mother discovers that the man who extended his hand to her might also be responsible for destroying the little she still calls home. In a scenario where kindness and corruption intertwine, the struggle for survival begins a journey of resistance, mystery, and redemption that will forever change the lives of everyone involved. The sky suddenly darkened over Old Beach, a small coastal town on the Brazilian shoreline. Eleanor clutched to her chest the paper bag where she kept her meager savings, the result of weeks selling crafts at the market. The first drops of rain began to fall, and she needed to take advantage of the supermarket still being open to buy food for her children, Michael and Sophia, aged 8 and 6. "Mommy, it's getting really dark," whispered Sophia, clinging to the hem of Eleanor's worn-out skirt. "Everything will be fine, my love. We'll just grab a few things quickly," she replied, trying to convey a sense of security she didn't feel. The wind began to howl between the buildings, carrying leaves and small debris. Inside the supermarket, the lights flickered ominously. Eleanor rushed through the aisles, grabbing only the essentials: rice, beans, pasta, some fruit. Her hands trembled as she mentally calculated whether the money would be enough. Prices had risen significantly since her last visit. In the checkout line, Michael was fascinated by a tall, well-dressed man who seemed out of place in the simple environment. His Italian suit contrasted with the casual clothes of the other customers, and he examined a bottle of wine as if he were at a tasting. "Don't point, son," Eleanor gently scolded him, noticing the boy's curious gaze. When it was her turn, Eleanor began placing the groceries on the conveyor belt, her heart racing. The total kept climbing on the display, and she realized she would need to put some items back. Her cheeks burned with anticipated shame. "That will be $297.65, announced the cashier. Eleanor swallowed hard. She only had $200. She started separating what she would return when a deep, polite voice sounded behind her. "Please, allow me." It was the man in the Italian suit. Without waiting for a response, he swiped his black credit card through the reader. Eleanor stood frozen, unsure how to react. "But, sir, I can't accept it as a gift from fate," he replied with an enigmatic smile. "Sometimes life surprises us in unexpected ways." Before Eleanor could properly thank him, a deafening thunderclap shook the building. The lights flickered violently and went out for a few seconds. When they came back on, the mysterious man had already disappeared. "Mommy, who was he?" asked Sophia, her eyes shining with curiosity. "I don't know, sweetheart," replied Eleanor, still dazed by what had just happened. But he was very kind. As they left the supermarket, the storm had intensified considerably. The sky was pitch black, and lightning bolts cut through the clouds in a terrifying spectacle. Eleanor and the children ran to take shelter under the awning of a closed store. It was then that the sirens began to sound throughout the town. A metallic voice echoed through the emergency loudspeakers installed on the poles. "Attention, residents of Old Beach! This is an official notification from Civil Defense. A severe storm is approaching the coast. Prepare to evacuate immediately. Repeat, prepare to evacuate immediately." Eleanor hugged her children, feeling panic rise in her chest. Her home, if you could even call the small shack in the seaside community that would certainly not withstand a storm of that magnitude. But where would they go? "Everything will be okay," she repeated, more to herself than to the children. "Let's find a safe place." As they ran through the soaked streets, Eleanor couldn't stop thinking about the stranger from the supermarket. There was something in his eyes, a mix of sadness and determination that intrigued her. Little did she know that this seemingly casual encounter would change her life forever. The wind howled louder and louder, carrying objects through the air and making the windows of houses tremble. The entire city seemed to be descending into a state of controlled chaos, with people running in every direction, carrying belongings and seeking shelter. Amid the chaos, Eleanor spotted the community center, one of the evacuation points designated by the city. It was her best chance for protection against the approaching storm. Holding firmly onto Michael and Sophia's hands, she ran toward the building, the shopping bag swinging precariously in her arms. That night, as the storm raged outside, Eleanor couldn't sleep. Lying on a makeshift mattress on the floor of the community center, she watched her children sleeping and thought about the mysterious man from the supermarket. Why would someone so obviously wealthy care about a homeless family? And why did she have the unsettling feeling that this wouldn't be their last encounter? Morning arrived with a hesitant brightness, as if the sun itself was wary after the previous night's storm. Eleanor woke to the buzz of people in the community center. Her children were still asleep, exhausted from the night's events. "Did you see the newspaper?" An excited voice caught her attention. That businessman Edward Vale bought half the city overnight. Eleanor approached the group, forming around a crumpled local newspaper. Her heart nearly stopped when she saw the photo on the front page. It was the man from the supermarket. Edward Vale, billionaire and CEO of the Vale Group, acquires extensive coastal areas in Old Beach, the headline read. Eleanor felt her legs weaken as she read that among the areas acquired was exactly the region where her community was established. "Mom?" Sophia's sleepy voice brought her back to reality. "Can we go home?" "Of course, my love. I just need to sort out a few things first." As they left the community center, the devastation caused by the storm was evident. Fallen trees flooded streets and debris scattered everywhere. But what caught Eleanor's attention the most were the men in suits roaming the town, taking photos and making notes. In the community, the atmosphere was tense. Groups of residents gathered in small circles, speaking in worried tones. It was Mrs. Zephyr, a woman who had lived there for over 2 decades, who brought the most unsettling news. "They say they're going to build a luxury resort here," she explained, wringing her hands in her apron. "A huge tourist complex with a marina and everything. They're using the storm as an excuse, saying they need to rebuild the area." Eleanor left the children with Mrs. Zephyr and went to the small community store to buy bread. Her shopping cart, where she kept her most important belongings, was exactly where she had left it the night before, sheltered under the store's awning. But something was different. There was a carefully folded note among her things. With trembling hands, she unfolded the paper. "Not everything is as it seems. Meet me at Mrs. Julia's cafe at 3 p.m. Come alone." The handwriting was elegant, but the note was unsigned. Eleanor looked around, trying to figure out who could have left that mysterious message. The only people nearby were the usual residents and a few men in suits who continued their inspection of the area. When she returned to her shack, Eleanor found an even larger group of residents gathered. In the center of the circle, a tall, thin man wearing a reflective vest spoke in an authoritative tone. "Mr. Vale has big plans for this area. The reconstruction after the storm will be thorough. You will receive official notices in the coming days, but it's best to start looking for another place to live." "But we've lived here for years," someone in the crowd protested. "That's not our problem," the man replied coldly. "The area now belongs to the Vale Group." Eleanor watched everything from a distance, feeling a mix of anger and confusion. How could the same man who had been so kind at the supermarket be behind something like this? There was something wrong with this story, and the mysterious note seemed to confirm her suspicions. At 2:45 p.m., after leaving the children with Mrs. Zephyr again, Eleanor headed to Mrs. Julia's cafe, a simple but cozy establishment in the center of town. The place was almost empty, except for a middle-aged man sitting in a corner, hidden behind a newspaper. "Eleanor Santos." The man lowered the newspaper, revealing a weathered face and sharp eyes behind thin-rimmed glasses. "My name is Rodrigo Menezes. I'm an investigative journalist with the Coastal Daily, and I have some information about Edward Vale that you need to know." Eleanor sat down, feeling like she was about to discover that the kindness at the supermarket was just the tip of a much larger and more complex iceberg. The journalist pulled a folder from his bag and began spreading documents across the table. "What do you know about the Development and Progress Consortium?" he asked, his eyes fixed on Eleanor's. "I've never heard of it," she replied honestly. "The Development and Progress Consortium is just the facade of something much bigger, Rodrigo explained, spreading more documents across the cafe table. Over the past 5 years, they've been involved in various revitalization projects in coastal communities across the country. The pattern is always the same. They arrive after some natural disaster, promising reconstruction and progress. Eleanor examined the photos the journalist showed her. Images of communities destroyed, not by natural disasters, but by tractors and demolition machines. Families displaced, protests, clashes. But what does this have to do with Edward Vale? He seemed so different, Eleanor hesitated, remembering the man from the supermarket. Vale is just a pawn in a much larger game, Rodrigo lowered his voice. The real mastermind behind everything is Diana Mendez, the vice president of the consortium. She's brilliant, charismatic, and utterly ruthless. At that moment, the cafe door opened, and an elegant woman walked in. Her impeccable tailored suit and poised demeanor immediately drew attention. Rodrigo quickly stashed the documents. "Speak of the devil," he murmured. "That's Diana Mendez." Eleanor watched as the woman approached the counter. There was something hypnotic about her movements, as if every gesture was meticulously calculated. Diana ordered a coffee, and as she waited, her eyes scanned the room, lingering for a moment on the table where Eleanor and Rodrigo were seated. "She has a special talent for manipulating people," Rodrigo continued in a low voice, "especially those who are emotionally vulnerable. And Edward Vale, well, he lost his family in a natural disaster 5 years ago. Diana found him at the perfect moment." Eleanor felt a shiver run down her spine as Diana began walking toward them. The woman stopped by their table, her expensive perfume filling the air. "Rodrigo Menezes," she smiled, though the smile didn't reach her eyes. "What a surprise to find you here. And who is your lovely companion?" "Just a source for a story on local crafts," Rodrigo replied, his tone casual. Diana turned to Eleanor, studying her with interest. "You seem familiar." "Oh, of course. You're the artisan from the seaside village community, aren't you?" "Edward mentioned you." "What a delightful coincidence." Eleanor felt her stomach drop. How had Edward Vale spoken about her? What else did Diana know? "I must say, I was deeply moved by your story," Diana continued, her voice honeyed. "In fact, we're planning a special project for your community. How about we have lunch together tomorrow? We could discuss some interesting opportunities for you and your children." Before Eleanor could respond, the cafe door opened again. It was Edward Vale himself, looking even more imposing in the daylight. His eyes met Eleanor's, and for a moment she saw something, guilt, fear, flash across his face. "Diana?" He called from the door. "We have that meeting with the mayor, remember?" "Ah, yes," Diana smiled again. "It was a pleasure to officially meet you, Eleanor. Think about my proposal. Here's my card." After they left, Eleanor looked at the card in her hands. Diana Mendez, Vice President of Strategic Development. The paper was thick, elegant, with embossed gold letters. "Don't trust her," Rodrigo warned. "Diana has a history of using people as pawns in her games. She's destroyed entire communities by manipulating local leaders, creating internal divisions, and promising benefits that never materialize." "But why? What is their real goal? Money, power, influence?" "The usual," Rodrigo sighed. "But there's something different this time. My sources indicate there's a much larger project underway, something that involves the entire coast, not just Old Beach." Eleanor tucked the card into her bag, her mind spinning with all the new information. She needed to get back to her children, but first she had one last question. "Why are you telling me all this?" Rodrigo stared at her for a long moment before answering, "Because you might be our only chance to expose the truth. Diana never makes mistakes, but this time she didn't account for Edward Vale's conscience awakening at the wrong moment. That encounter at the supermarket wasn't a coincidence, Eleanor. Vale is trying to send a message, even if he doesn't realize it yet." As she left the cafe, Eleanor noticed a dark van parked across the street. Through the tinted windows, she could swear she saw someone taking photos. The feeling of being watched didn't leave her the entire way home. In the streets of the community, Residents were still discussing the day's news, but now there was a new tension in the air. Some looked at Eleanor with suspicion. Clearly her meeting with Diana hadn't gone unnoticed. Others approached her, curious about what the consortium representative had said to her. In her shack, Eleanor found another note, this time pinned to the door. "Be careful who you trust. The walls have ears." The handwriting was different from the first message, more urgent and careless. The next morning dawned with unusual activity in the community. A group of engineers, accompanied by black-suited security guards, was taking measurements and photos. Eleanor watched everything from the window of her shack as she prepared breakfast for Michael and Sophia. "Mummy, why are those men looking at our house?" asked Sophia, her big eyes filled with concern. Before Eleanor could respond, a commotion was heard outside. It was Mr. Joseph, one of the oldest residents, arguing heatedly with one of the men in suits. "You have no right! My family has lived here for 3 generations!" shouted the man, his face red with anger. The security guard maintained an impassive expression. "Sir, this area now belongs to the Vale Group. I suggest you start looking for another place to live." Eleanor felt her blood boil. She left the children with the neighbor and headed to the scene of the argument. As she walked, she noticed other residents also approaching, forming a tense circle around the scene. "Excuse me," she interjected, her voice firmer than she felt inside. "We would like to see some official documentation about this supposed ownership." The man in the suit turned to her, a condescending smile on his lips. "Ah, you must be Eleanor Santos. Miss Diana Mendez mentioned you might cause problems." A murmur spread through the crowd. Eleanor felt the gazes of her neighbors on her, some curious, others accusatory. "Is it true you're working with them?" asked Mary, a young mother who lived 2 houses down. "Selling information about the community?" "No," Eleanor protested. "That's absurd." But the seed of doubt had already been planted. Eleanor could see in her neighbor's eyes that something had changed. The trust, built over years, was beginning to crumble. It was at that moment that an unknown woman walked through the group. She wore simple clothes, but there was something about her demeanor that caught attention. "My name is Clara Ribeiro," she announced, her voice calm but authoritative. "And I can say with certainty that these men have no legal authority to be here." The security guard stepped forward, intimidating. "And who are you to make such a claim?" "Someone who has seen this movie before," Clara replied, pulling a phone from her pocket. "And I suggest you and your team leave now, before I start making some very interesting calls." To everyone's surprise, the men in suits exchanged worried glances, and after a brief radio discussion, began to retreat. As soon as they left, Clara turned to Eleanor. "We need to talk, in private." The 2 women headed to Eleanor's shack, followed by the curious gazes of the residents. Inside, Clara surveyed the surroundings with experienced eyes before speaking. 3 years ago, I lived in a community like this one in Angra dos Reis," she began. "Diana Mendez showed up after a landslide, promising reconstruction and improvements. In the end, we lost everything." Eleanor sat down, feeling the weight of Clara's words. How did she do it? The same way she's doing it here, dividing the community, creating distrust, isolating the people who could represent resistance. Clara paused. "But this time it's different. This time we have a chance to stop her." "Because of Edward Vale?" Eleanor asked, recalling the journalist's words. Clara nodded. "Vale isn't like the other businessmen Diana usually works with. He has principles. And more importantly, he has a past she doesn't fully know about." At that moment, someone knocked on the door. It was Rodrigo, the journalist, looking agitated. "I found something," he said, quickly stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "Old documents from the 1980s. This land, it was officially donated to the community by the former owner, Anthony Vale." Eleanor felt her heart stop for a moment. "Vale? How?" "Anthony Vale was Edward's father," Rodrigo explained, "and he had a very different vision for social development. Unfortunately, he disappeared during a storm, very similar to the one we had yesterday when Edward was still a teenager." Clara took the documents Rodrigo offered, examining them carefully. "This changes everything. If we can prove the authenticity of these papers—" "It won't be that simple," Rodrigo interrupted. "Diana probably already knows about them. Why do you think she's moving so fast?" A noise from outside caught the group's attention. Through the window they saw several vans arriving in the community. Men began unloading demolition equipment. The arrival of the demolition equipment caused immediate chaos in the community. Residents ran back and forth, some trying to protect their belongings, others shouting in protest. Eleanor, Clara, and Rodrigo watched the commotion with apprehension. "This is illegal!" Clara exclaimed, already grabbing her phone. "They can't start a demolition without a court order." At that moment, a procession of official city cars entered the community. From the first vehicle emerged Mayor Robert Almeida, dressed in an impeccable suit and flashing his usual political smile. Beside him, Diana Mendez walked with her usual elegance, whispering something in his ear. "Attention, residents of Seaside Village," the mayor's voice echoed through a megaphone. "After a detailed technical analysis, this area has been declared a risk zone. For public safety reasons, we will begin the evacuation process today." Eleanor felt her stomach churn. Beside her, Rodrigo frantically photographed the scene with his phone. "This doesn't make sense," he murmured. "A risk zone declaration requires technical studies that take months. How did they manage this in less than 48 hours? Clara grabbed the old documents she was still holding and began walking toward the mayor. Eleanor followed her, her heart racing. "Mr. Mayor," Clara called, her voice firm. "You can't authorize this demolition. We have documents here that prove this land was legally donated to the community." The mayor's smile faltered for a moment, but Diana quickly stepped between them. "Ah, you must be Clara Ribeiro," Diana said, her tone falsely sweet. "Still trying to cause trouble, aren't you? How did your last attempt at resistance end?" Clara paled but stood her ground. "This time is different, Diana. You won't be able to bypass the law so easily." "Law?" Diana laughed, a musical but joyless sound. "Darling, the law is like water, it always finds a way. Mayor, please proceed with the procedure." Suddenly a new figure appeared on the scene. Edward Vale emerged from one of the cars, his face a mask of concern. "Diana, we need to talk," he said, his voice tense. "I just received some troubling information about the project." "Not now, Edward," Diana replied, without taking her eyes off Clara and Eleanor. "We're in the middle of something important." "It's about my father," Edward insisted, and this time Diana turned, her expression shifting subtly. Eleanor took advantage of the distraction to approach the mayor. "Mr. Mayor, please, there are children here. Entire families, we can't just—" "I'm sorry," the mayor interrupted, though his tone showed no real regret. "But the decision has already been made. This area will be revitalized for the good of the entire city." At that moment, Rodrigo approached with his phone in hand. "Interesting. And does this decision have anything to do with the deposits the consortium made into your account in the Cayman Islands?" The mayor froze. Diana, who was still talking to Edward, turned abruptly. "This is slander," protested the mayor, his face red. "You have no proof." "No?" Rodrigo smiled, showing something on his phone. "I have very interesting sources in the international banking system, Mayor, and they love to talk about suspicious transactions." Diana walked over to them, her heels clicking on the dirt floor. Her expression was controlled, but there was something dangerous in her eyes. "Mr. Menezes, I presume," she said softly. "How about we talk in private? I'm sure we can reach an agreement that benefits everyone." "I'm sorry, but I'm not interested in deals," Rodrigo replied, taking a step back. "The story is already ready, just waiting for my signal to go live." Eleanor watched the scene unfold, noticing the subtle shifts in the power dynamics. Edward Vale seemed increasingly uncomfortable, alternating glances between Diana and the residents. It was then that Sophia, who had escaped the neighbor's watch, ran up to Eleanor. "Mommy, look what I found in our backyard," she exclaimed, holding a dirt-covered metallic object. Diana visibly paled upon seeing the object. Edward approached, his eyes fixed on what the girl was holding. "This," he murmured, "this belonged to my father." It was an old brass compass with inscriptions engraved on the lid. Edward took it with trembling hands, opening it carefully. "To my son Edward, who will always find the right path," he read aloud, his voice choked. "I gave this to him on the day." "Edward, we have more important matters to attend to," Diana interrupted, her voice harsher than usual. But Edward was no longer listening. His eyes scanned the community, lingering on the faces of the people, the children watching in fear, the elderly who refused to leave their homes. "What are we doing here, Diana?" he asked, his voice shifting. "What are we really doing?" The silence that followed Edward's question was heavy, almost palpable. Diana maintained her poised stance, but her eyes betrayed growing irritation. The community residents, the authorities, and even the demolition crew seemed frozen in time, waiting for the next move in this tense chess game. "Edward, darling," Diana began, her voice as sweet as ever, "you're letting your emotions cloud your judgment. Remember what happened the last time—" "No," Edward interrupted her, still holding the compass. "Not this time, Diana. You've been using my memories, my traumas, to manipulate me for years. But this is different." Eleanor watched the scene with a racing heart, feeling she was witnessing a pivotal moment. Clara discreetly began recording everything on her phone, while Rodrigo continued taking photos. "Manipulate is such a strong word," Diana replied, trying to maintain control of the situation. "I simply helped him channel his pain into something productive. We transformed abandoned places into development centers. We created jobs, economic growth, at the expense of entire families," Clara couldn't hold back. "Destroying communities, tearing people apart, ruining lives." Diana shot a sharp look at Clara, but before she could respond, a new character entered the scene. It was a middle-aged woman wearing a municipal cleaning staff uniform. She walked determinedly toward the group, carrying an old folder. "Mr. Vale," she called, her voice trembling but resolute. "My name is Jurema, and I worked for your father 25 years ago." Edward turned, surprised. Diana stepped forward, but Jurema continued. "Your father, he had other plans for this area, plans that Mrs. Mendez made sure to hide." "What are you talking about?" Edward asked while Diana tried to intervene. "This woman is clearly disturbed. Security." But Jurema was already opening the folder, revealing blueprints, documents, and old photographs. "Your father planned to turn this area into a self-sustaining community center, with schools, health clinics, recreational areas, all managed by the community itself. He believed that true progress came from the bottom up, not the other way around." Eleanor stepped closer, recognizing in the old photos a younger version of the man she had met at the supermarket, Anthony Vale, Edward's father. In the images, he appeared smiling, surrounded by community members, including a younger version of Jurema. "Why was I never told about this?" Edward asked, his voice choked with emotion. "Because I didn't allow it," Diana replied coldly, finally dropping her mask of cordiality. "Your father was a foolish idealist, Edward. He never understood how the world truly works. After his disappearance, I had to redirect his investments towards something more pragmatic." "You—" Edward stared at her, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. "You always knew about my father's plans for this place. You deliberately brought me here using my own trauma to do what needed to be done," Diana finished, her voice now harsh. "Do you think you built an empire by being nice like your father? No. It was thanks to my guidance, my decisions, that the Vale Group became what it is today." The mayor, who had been nervously watching everything, tried to intervene. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion in a more private setting." "Shut up, Robert," Diana snapped, startling everyone with her sudden outburst. "You're as disposable as all the other politicians we've bought over the years." Rodrigo smiled, his phone still recording. "This is going to look great on the front page." Diana quickly composed herself, but the damage was already done. Her true nature had been exposed, and there was no turning back. "Mr. Vale," Eleanor approached, holding Sophia by the hand, "your father didn't just disappear in that storm by chance, did he?" The silence that followed was deafening. Diana kept her expression neutral, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of concern. "What are you implying?" Edward asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "That night," Jurema interjected, Your father had an important meeting. He said he finally had enough evidence to expose a corruption scheme involving some of his partners. He never made it to the meeting. Edward staggered as if he had been punched. The compass in his hands seemed to weigh a ton. Diana remained, still, but her eyes quickly scanned the possible exits, calculating her options. Time seemed to have frozen in Seaside Village. The sound of the demolition machines had ceased, and even the wind appeared to have stopped blowing. All eyes were fixed on Diana Mendez, who maintained an artificial calm in the face of the accusations. "This is ridiculous," she finally spoke, her voice controlled but with a note of tension. "You have no proof of anything. These are just speculations from a former maid and a homeless woman." "Actually," Rodrigo interjected, rummaging through his briefcase, "I have something that might interest everyone." He pulled out a manila envelope and handed it to Edward. "I found this in the newspaper archives. They're records of bank transfers from the night your father disappeared." Edward opened the envelope with trembling hands. His eyes scanned the documents and his face gradually lost its color. "Diana," he whispered, "why did you transfer $5 million to an account in the Cayman Islands on the same night my father—" "It was a legitimate investment," she cut him off quickly. "You're letting insignificant people plant doubts in your mind, Edward. After all we've done together, are you really going to question my decisions?" Eleanor watched the scene unfold when she noticed a suspicious movement. Diana's security team began positioning themselves strategically around the group. Clara also noticed and discreetly signaled to some locals, who started to approach. "Mr. Vale," Eleanor stepped forward, "when we met at the supermarket during the storm, was it really a coincidence?" Edward looked at her, then at the compass in his hands, and finally at Diana. "No," he replied slowly. "I had seen your photos in Diana's reports. Something told me I needed to meet you in person, to understand why this specific community was so important to Diana. It was important because your father left documents here," Jurima revealed, "documents that could expose the entire scheme. Diana knew that. That's why she was in such a hurry. To demolish everything, to use the storm as an excuse." Diana let out a cold laugh. "Do you really think you can stop this? I've built an empire. I have judges, politicians, businessmen, all on my payroll. You are nothing." "Maybe," Clara replied, holding up her phone. "But now we have your confession. Recorded." Diana's face changed for the first time, an expression of genuine shock crossing her flawless features. She made a subtle gesture, and her security team began to move. "Take their phones," she ordered. "Everyone!" But before the security guards could act, a crowd of residents emerged from all directions. There were dozens of people, all with their phones in hand, all recording. "So you forgot one thing, Diana," Eleanor said, her voice firm. "In a community, everyone looks out for each other. Your words have already been broadcast live to thousands of people." The mayor, who had been watching everything in panic, began to discreetly back away. "Where do you think you're going, Robert?" Diana hissed. "You're going down with me." "No, Diana," he replied, sweating. "It's over. I've already called my lawyer. I'm going to make a plea deal." Edward stepped forward, his demeanor completely changed. For the first time since Eleanor had known him, he seemed truly in control. "Security," he called, his voice thundering with authority. "As president of the Vale Group, I order you to detain Mrs. Mendez until the police arrive." Diana laughed, but there was a hint of hysteria in her voice. "You can't do this. The board has already been notified," Edward interrupted her. "As well as the federal police and Interpol. Did you really think I wouldn't investigate my father's death forever?" It was then that something unexpected happened. Michael, who had been watching from a distance, shouted, "Mom, look! At Mr. Joseph's shack!" Everyone turned to see smoke rising from one of the houses. Diana took advantage of the distraction to try to escape, but Clara was ready. With a quick move, she blocked Diana's path. "Don't even think about it," Clara said. "I let you slip away once. Never again." The residents quickly organized to put out the small fire, while Edward used his phone to call the police. Diana, now restrained by the very guards who once protected her, watched her empire crumble with a look of contained fury. Eleanor hugged her children, feeling for the first time in a long while that maybe, just maybe, The future could be different. It was then that she noticed something glinting among the debris near the burning shack. The metallic glint among the rubble caught Eleanor's attention. Carefully, she approached the spot, followed by Edward and Clara. There, partially exposed, by the water used to extinguish the fire, was a small safe. "That safe," Jurema whispered, stepping closer with wide eyes. "Mr. Joseph always said he kept something important for his father, Mr. Vale. Something that was meant to stay hidden until the right moment." Edward knelt on the damp ground, his hands trembling slightly as he examined the safe. It was an old model with a combination lock. "The compass," Eleanor suddenly said. "The inscription on the compass." Edward picked up the object he was still holding and examined it again. On the back, almost invisible, were engraved numbers. "Coordinates," he murmured, and then his eyes lit up with understanding. "No, it's the combination." Carefully, he turned the numbers on the safe's lock. A soft click was heard and the door opened. Diana, still restrained by the security guards, tried to move closer to see the contents but was stopped. Her face was a mask of fury and fear. Inside the safe was an old folder, documents yellowed with time, and a flash drive. But what caught the most attention was an envelope, sealed with wax, bearing the words, "To my son Edward, when the truth comes to light." With trembling hands, Edward opened the envelope and began to read aloud. "My dear son, if you are reading this letter, it means my suspicions were correct. Diana Mendez is not who she appears to be. She is part of an international organization that uses development projects as a front for money laundering and real estate speculation. I discovered her plans for our company when I noticed discrepancies in the financial reports. Each revitalization project was, in fact, a complex operation to displace entire communities and reconfigure strategic territories. Seaside Village is special, Edward, not just because of the documents I hid here, but because of what it represents. This community is living proof that real development does not mean destroying what exists, but building together, respecting people and their stories. On the flash drive, you will find all the evidence: bank transfers, emails, fraudulent contracts, everything you need to expose the scheme. If something happens to me, trust Jurema. She knows the importance of keeping these documents safe until the right moment. Son, you have always been stronger than you think. The compass I gave you is not just a navigation tool. It is a reminder that we can always choose the right path, no matter how long it takes to find it. With love, your father." A profound silence fell over everyone. Edward held the letter tightly, silent tears streaming down his face. "It's over, Diana," he finally said, his voice steady. "Everything you built, all your lies, it's over." Diana maintained her haughty demeanor, but her eyes betrayed her desperation. "You don't understand, Edward. I did what was necessary. The world doesn't run on foolish idealisms like your father's." "No," Clara interjected. "You did what was convenient for you and your associates. You destroyed lives, tore families apart, all in the name of profit." Eleanor watched the scene when she noticed something strange. One of Diana's security guards was discreetly fiddling with his radio, and other men in suits began moving suspiciously around the community. "Edward," she whispered, "I think we should—" Before she could finish the sentence, sirens began to sound in the distance. But they weren't police sirens. They were the storm warnings from civil defense. "A new storm is approaching," a metallic voice announced over the town's loudspeakers. "All citizens must seek shelter immediately." The sky, already heavy, darkened even more. Strong winds began to blow, carrying leaves and debris. It was as if nature itself was responding to the tension of the moment. "The documents," Edward said urgently. "We need to protect them." But when he turned to the safe, he realized Diana had managed to free herself. Amid the chaos caused by the storm warning, she was running toward a car that had just skidded to a stop on the dirt road. The wind howled through the shacks of Seaside Village, carrying the first heavy drops of rain. Diana had managed to get into the black car waiting for her, taking with her the flash drive containing the evidence against her. The confusion was total. Residents ran for shelter, while the men in suits scattered in different directions. "The children," Eleanor shouted, remembering that Michael and Sophia were with the neighbor. Panic gripped her heart when she didn't see them immediately. "I'll go after Diana," Edward said quickly, already running to his car. "Clara, help Eleanor find the children. Rodrigo, protect the documents." The storm intensified with every second. Lightning split the dark sky, illuminating the scene in dramatic flashes. Eleanor ran between the shacks, calling for her children, with Clara close behind her. "Over there!" Clara pointed to the community center, where a group of residents had taken shelter. Michael and Sophia were there, safe with Mrs. Zephyr. "Mommy!" The children ran into Eleanor's arms and she held them tightly. "We need to get to a safer place," Clara warned, eyeing the increasingly threatening sky. "This structure might not hold if the storm gets worse." At that moment, Rodrigo rushed into the community center, drenched and out of breath. "The documents are safe," he reported, showing his waterproof backpack. "But something's wrong. Diana's men, they didn't flee. They're positioning themselves around the community." As if to confirm his words, the headlights of several cars lit up simultaneously, surrounding Seaside Village in a circle of light. The rain now fell in heavy sheets, reducing visibility. "She won't give up," Clara murmured. "Diana never leaves loose ends." A car skidded in the mud in front of the community center. It was Edward, who quickly stepped out of the vehicle. "Diana is heading to the harbor," he informed, water dripping down his face. "There's a yacht waiting for her, but first—" He hesitated, looking at Eleanor. "First, she wants to make a deal." "What kind of deal?" Eleanor asked, though she already suspected the answer. "She wants you, Eleanor. She said she has a revelation that will change everything, something about your past and mine." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. Diana's words from their first meeting echoed in her mind. What a delightful coincidence. "It wasn't a coincidence at all, was it?" Eleanor asked, her voice almost lost in the noise of the storm. "From the very beginning." "No," Edward confirmed. Diana knew. She always knew. A particularly loud thunderclap made the entire community center shake. The lights flickered and went out, leaving only the ghostly illumination of the lightning. "Eleanor," Jurema approached, her voice urgent. "There's something you need to know. On the night Anthony Vale disappeared, he wasn't alone." The pieces began to fall into place in Eleanor's mind. The fragmented memories of her childhood, the accident that had taken her parents, the inexplicable sense of familiarity when she first saw Edward at the supermarket. "My mother," Eleanor whispered. "She worked for your father, didn't she?" "It was more than that," Jurema replied. "She was the key witness against Diana. She was helping Anthony gather the evidence. On the night of the storm, they were together when a deafening crash interrupted the revelation. Part of the community center's roof began to give way under the force of the storm. "Everyone out!" Clara shouted, helping to organize the evacuation. As people rushed to safety, the headlights of the cars surrounding the community began to move, tightening the encirclement. Diana's voice echoed through a loudspeaker. "This is your last chance, Eleanor. Come to the harbor alone or everyone here will find out what really happened that night." Edward held Eleanor's arm. "Don't go, she's bluffing." "No, she's not," Eleanor replied, looking at her children. "Diana never bluffs. She just twists the truth to her advantage." The rain continued to fall mercilessly, turning the streets of Seaside Village into rivers of mud. Lightning illuminated the worried faces of the residents who huddled under any available shelter. "Then we go together," Edward decided. "No more games, no more manipulation. It's time to face the truth, whatever it may be." Eleanor looked at Clara, who nodded in understanding. "I'll take care of the children," she promised. "Go." As Eleanor and Edward raced toward the harbor, the storm seemed to intensify its fury, as if nature itself wanted to prevent the secrets of the past from finally coming to light. On the horizon, the lights of Diana's yacht flickered like a grim beacon, calling them to a final confrontation that would change their lives forever. The harbor of Old Beach was nearly deserted when Eleanor and Edward arrived. The storm roared. With full force, massive waves crashing against the breakwater. Diana's yacht swayed violently, its lights flickering in the darkness. "There!" Edward pointed to a sleek figure waiting under the shelter of a warehouse. Even drenched by the rain, Diana maintained her haughty posture. "What a touching scene," she remarked as they approached. The children of Anthony Vale and Mary Santos, together again, just like 20 years ago. "Enough games, Diana," Edward E. demanded. "What's the truth?" Diana smiled, a cold smile that didn't reach her eyes. "The truth, dear Edward, is that your father and Eleanor's mother were about to destroy everything I had built. They had evidence, witnesses, documents, but they made one crucial mistake. They trusted the wrong people. My parents' accident," Eleanor began, her voice trembling. "Wasn't exactly an accident, was it?" Diana finished, pulling an envelope from her coat. "Here's the whole truth, documented and preserved. I always keep records, you know. You never know when they might come in handy." A flash of lightning illuminated the scene, followed immediately by a deafening clap of thunder. The storm was directly above them now. "Why?" Edward asked, his voice heavy with pain. "Why keep this a secret all these years?" "Power, my dear. The secret gave me power over you, over your guilt, over your decisions. And now," she looked at Eleanor, "now, it gives me power over the future of Seaside Village." "You're bluffing," Eleanor stepped forward. "All your secrets have already come to light. Rodrigo has the evidence, the police are on their way. But I'm sure the press would love to know how little Eleanor Santos, the heroine of the homeless, is actually the rightful heir to part of the Vale Group. Your mother and Anthony Vale weren't just investigating my business that night, dear. They were planning the future for both of you together." The revelation struck Eleanor and Edward like a bolt of lightning. Fragmented memories began to make sense. The secret meetings, the whispers, the knowing smiles between their parents. The Seaside Village project, Edward suddenly understood. It wasn't just a social project, it was a legacy. For both of us. "Exactly," Diana exclaimed. "And now everything can be resolved civilly. Eleanor relinquishes her rights, the community is removed, and everyone moves on with their lives." Or she didn't finish the threat. She didn't need to. The envelope in her hands said it all. Then, something unexpected happened. A group of people emerged from the storm. Clara, Rodrigo, Jurema, and dozens of residents from Seaside Village, all drenched but determined. "It won't work, Diana," Clara announced. "Your threats have no power here anymore." Rodrigo raised his phone, protected by a waterproof case. "Live broadcast, thousands of people watching. There's no hiding the truth anymore." Diana took a step back but held her composure. "You don't understand. I still have the documents, the evidence." "No," a new voice rang out. "You don't." It was the yacht captain, emerging from the rain with a flash drive in his hand. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Mendez, but there are some things money can't buy." Diana looked around, realizing she was surrounded. Her security guards had vanished, likely already detained by the approaching police with sirens blaring. "It's over," Edward declared, taking the envelope from Diana's hands without resistance. "But not the way you planned." Eleanor stepped closer to Diana, who for the first time seemed truly defeated. "Do you know what your mistake was?" Eleanor asked softly. "Thinking that secrets and fear are stronger than truth and unity." The sirens were closer now. The storm was beginning to subside, as if its fury had served only to wash away the sins of the past. 3 months later, Seaside Village had been transformed. Not by bulldozers and demolition machines, but by a joint project between its residents and the new board of the Vale Group. Anthony Vale's dream was finally taking shape. A modern community centre, a vocational school, a health clinic, and recreational areas, all managed by the community itself. Eleanor and Edward discovered in Diana's documents not only the truth about the past, but also a path to the future. Their parents' original project had been updated and expanded, now serving as a model for other communities. "Mom, Grandpa Anthony, would be proud, wouldn't he?" asked Sophia, watching the children playing in the new community park. Eleanor smiled, looking at Edward as he approached with blueprints and plans under his arm. "Yes, dear. Both he and your grandmother Mary would be very proud. Sometimes it takes a storm to clear the sky and show the right path." Edward joined them, carrying the old compass that now served as the project's symbol. "The right path," he repeated, smiling, "and this time we'll follow it together." On the horizon, the sun set over Old Beach. painting the sky with vibrant colors that reflected in the windows of the new community center. At the entrance of the building, a simple yet meaningful plaque announced, "Vale Santos Project, Building. Futures Preserving Histories." Diana Mendez awaited trial, her confessions and the revealed documents ensuring that she and her associates would face justice. The Development and Progress Consortium had been dissolved, and its predatory practices exposed across the country. Most importantly, Seaside Village had become a symbol of resilience and renewal, proving that real development doesn't mean destroying what exists, but building on foundations of respect, dignity, and community. And so, where there had once been fear and uncertainty, hope now flourished. The storm had passed, leaving in its wake not destruction but the chance for a new beginning. A beginning built not by imposition but by choice, not by fear but by love.